Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Little Lies, Big Topics. In this episode, pediatric ophthalmologist Dr. Gregory Ostrow speaks about his company Sydnexis and its patented formulation of low-dose atropine for myopia control. He also shares pearls of entrepreneurship with Dr. Jennifer Galvin.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Galvin, and this is our APOS podcast, Little Lies, Big Topics. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Greg Ostrow, and he is a pediatric ophthalmologist based in San Diego, California. He's also a director of corporate relations at APOS, as well as an entrepreneur, a sushi chef, a exotic fruit farmer, and an organic gardener. But today we're really just going to focus on his entrepreneurism and pediatric ophthalmology and the starting of Sydnexis.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
And so tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to starting your company, Sydnexis.
Sydnexis, so about 10 years ago, I've always been sort of a outside the box doctor, which I think almost all pediatric ophthalmologists are. We're sort of the free thinkers and the imaginative minds. And so we're always trying to come up with solutions to problems and fix things in ways they haven't been fixed. And about 10 years ago, when the original ATOM 2 data came out, before they did the rebound data, where they showed that these lower doses of atropine could slow the progression of nearsightedness without all the side effects and without the rebound. Well, we didn't know the rebound then, but without all the side effects, I have a large Asian population in Southern California, and since I started practice, it was one of those things where I did not have anything to offer. And all of a sudden I had something to offer, which was this low dose atropine. So I immediately jumped on board. And this may have been late 2013. And so it was difficult at the time to get atropine drops. We had to order them from various compounders who had not been making them because this wasn't something that was made before. And what I noticed, and I followed these patients more closely than we do now because this was a new therapy, was that kids were coming in, some with dilated pupils, some complained that the drops stung, some complained that they didn't sting, some had no pupillary response at all. We were paying much more closer attention when this was a new thing. And I thought to myself, what is going on here? Are they actually making the dose that I gave them? And I was trying to figure out a way to measure that. And just for background, in college, I was a software engineer and a chemistry major. So I wasn't the standard pre-med guy, which a lot of us weren't, right? And so, but I had a chemistry background. And so I kind of, we all had to take organic and whatever else, but I had a chemistry background, a little bit of a chemistry mind. And so I got a grant from a nonprofit to basically take a look at these. I figured I'd publish a paper on this and it would be something everybody would want to know. You got to pay attention to where you're getting your compounded medicine. This was my thought at the time, right? Because nobody had really, this was brand new stuff. And so the goal was to just get a grant, publish a paper. And so I got the grant. I hired an outside chemistry lab to do this. So I didn't do it through work at all. I actually hired an outside chemistry lab, and I kind of did this as a totally aside thing from the beginning. And so I knew the experiments I wanted done, but I reached out to the compounders and asked them sort of what recipe they were using. And at the time, they would all tell you. And they were all different recipes from different books. Okay. So the first thing I found out is that they were putting different stuff in, different buffers and some were pH adjusting, some weren't, but they didn't know what they were pH adjusting to. And the way they were mixing it up was different. Some were diluting already 1%. Some were taking, the atropine powder and making it. So it was a wide variety. But so what I did is I both took a bunch of bottles from each of them and measured what was in the bottle, and I put them on stability. One thing that happened early on when I was deciding to do this is I went to some friends that ended up founding the company with me. One of them, Ken Witter, was a serial entrepreneur and venture capitalist. He'd started eye companies, GI companies, run a bunch of them, brought them from start to finish. And the other, Jackie Johnson, who she had also been involved in various pharma companies and in various, what it took to produce things, et cetera. But at the time, this was not what I had in mind. The reason I went to them was because I knew that they had done research on different compounds. They helped me find the lab to do it, where they knew the lab, and they knew, a bunch of consultants in various things. And before we were paying consultants, we could call their friends and just ask them questions about stuff. I don't remember the exact time frame, but the first thing we did was measure what was in those bottles, and it was widely different, both in the strength that was in them, what the pH was. Everything about those bottles was widely different. But moreover, if you we put those things on stability, we put them on sort of regular room temperature, kind of hot, and really hot, basically. Okay, so you can accelerate the breakdown by simulating hotter temperatures. You can also do it with different levels of light. There are a whole bunch of different variables. They knew this stuff, not me at the time. Okay, now, having gone through this, I know this stuff, right? But back then they knew what different ways you had to look at compounds when you're doing sort of what's called CMC, which is chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. This is part of every pharma, because they do this in every pharma company, because they have to be so precision, and they have to know everything about their compound before they bring it. There's so much that goes into just the manufacturing to make sure it's perfect in a pharma grade, not a compounding grade.
Started with your patients, for sure. You were not only a good observer, but like you said, you had this scientific chemistry mind, but you knew that it wasn't necessary for you to go back and do the bench work yourself, but then collaborating. How can you make things better from what you were observing in your patients, and then knowing that while the intentionality may have been, it wasn't working as the compounded compound because there was just too much variability.
Right, but it ended up not being the variability. It ended up being the stability that was the issue. So we put these things on, and because atropine has been around forever, right? You've been using 1% atropine since you've been in practice. Atropine 1% is shelf stable because the breakdown products self buffer, right? That it breaks down in a one-to-one fashion with base catalyzed hydrolysis. You don't care about the chemistry nerd stuff, but the actual breakdown, some people might. So the actual breakdown product, right, the tropic acid self buffers it. But when you dilute it, the molecules are too far apart. And so it doesn't self buffer. And so base catalyzed hydrolysis, the only way to attenuate this, and there's been a lot of drugs that never came to market because you had to acidify them too much to make them useful. Okay, lots of drugs. And so this is like a known thing. Attenuating base catalyzed hydrolysis is not easy to do. The solution is to acidify, okay? But you can't put an acidified drop in a kid's eye. So all of a sudden we had a problem, and Ken, who had filed a ton of patents and is like a super patent nerd, said, "Oh wow, we got a problem here. We need to file IP right now." So what we did is, IP is intellectual property. We filed patents. We talked to a physical chemist, came up with every possible way we could solve this problem, and then came up with a few weird random ways. And it's outside the scope of this podcast to talk about how we came up with the actual solution, which is awesome. But that was sort of a unique find. Okay. So anyway, there was a unique find that we discovered that deuterated deuterated water, which is sort of water where the hydrogen bonds are a little bit stronger. The hydrogens have an extra neutron, and this is sort of a naturally occurring substance in your body. Okay, like 0.17% of your naturally occurring water is deuterated water, and it's everywhere in nature. But deuterated water attenuated that base catalyzed hydrolysis without having to acidify it at all. And so it basically, at physiologic pH, like 100-fold better results, like almost two pH PD.
It stabilized the atropine, is what you're saying.
Right. And this was an awesome find, right? And so this obviously resulted in various patents for atropine, but then a multiple families of patents based on this concept that deuterated water could stabilize compounds. And so all of a sudden we had something real. we the three of us decided to start a company. I got to choose the name. So I named it after my daughters, Sydney and Alexis.
Sydnexis. So that's so cool that you named this company after your daughters, Sydney and Alexis. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Both my wife and I are myopic. I'm moderate. She's moderate to high, or was before she had laser correction. And as neurotic as we pediatric ophthalmologists are, I was dilating and cyclopleging my kids every year and watched them lose their hyperopic buffer. So I made the decision to put them on atropine prophylactically, super off label. And so it seemed like this was very near and dear to my heart, because it would be really nice to have pharmaceutical grade approved product that my kids could have in their eyes. And at the time, I didn't realize how long the process was going to take, right? My 18-year-old actually just stopped using atropine. My 15-year-old is still using it. Neither one of them wears glasses.
Wow, that's
I know.
fantastic.
So like not consistent with sort of, the studies, but it worked prophylactically in both of my kids. Yeah.
It's really wonderful, Dr. Ostrow. And so we've covered this a little in terms of what led to starting the company, but how long was it in general, this path from idea to fruition?
So believe it or not, so this was 2014, right? It's been 10 years, but we got the short path because atropine was already known to be safe in children. So if you were trying to come up with a drug that did not already have a safety profile in children, I mean, it would be at least another 5 years on top of all that. So drug development is a long process, and there are so many different steps to it along the way. So yeah, it's been so once we had patents, we went and had to find funding, because in order to get all the studies done, we went and met with the FDA. They told us what we needed to do before we could start a clinical trial. So then we went out and got funding. Before we got funding from venture capital, we tried to sell it to big pharma. And
Okay,
so
how did that go?
big pharma was almost, I would say most of the companies that I contacted met with us. And we certainly weren't anywhere near as professional as we are now. I mean, we were pretty good because I had Ken and Jackie and they knew what they were doing, but we weren't like a company at the time, right? It was us working together on a shoestring budget, sort of flying around to JP Morgan and actually, so the company that we actually got the farthest with at the time was Allergan at the time. And so we presented to Allergan, and at the time, the guy in charge of business development, he'd been in charge of a lot of their acquisitions over the years, and Restasis, I forget all of the ones, but a lot of it. He's a big guy at Allergan, super charismatic guy, and actually my good friend now, Patrick Johnson is his name, no relation to Jackie Johnson, even though they both have the same last name. After we presented and they did all their diligence, and it was such a long project, and he had to call us and say basically they don't, it's funny, they didn't want to move ahead at the time. And then he, like, I guess it maybe was a week later after that, he called us up and said, I'd really like to jump on board.
Wow.
And it was funny because he knew we had no money. So he said basically, I'll take some equity. Let me come work from you. Let's go get this thing going. And so, we brought Patrick on board, and he's now, at the time he wasn't the president, but now he's actually the president of the company. He's got a great business mind, and he's kind of, he's just super thorough, and is definitely the right guy to be running the company right now, and is bringing it forward. So as soon as he kind of got us in contact with a lot of his venture capital friends, Ken's venture capital friends, they immediately wanted to invest. We got a lot of money and got to move forward.
That's really great. I think the value of that presentation hit home with someone like Patrick Johnson, and that he was willing to take the risk of leaving his big pharma job and becoming part of your company. And then I know that you're just in the midst of or almost completing the STAR study, the phase 3 clinical trial. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, in 2023, so many myopic clinical studies has come out and been published. In their data in particular, 4 studies came out. So what do you think an eye doctor should know, who takes care of kids, about the STAR study, about your phase 3 clinical trial?
The STAR study. So part of what the experience of the people that I worked with brought to the table was that we needed to do the largest study. We needed it to be big enough to definitely be powered enough, but also for things like subgroup analysis in the future, et cetera. And so, the STAR study is by far the largest study, over 800 patients, over 40 sites in the US and Europe. And I mean, it's an order of magnitude more robust in order to be clear about efficacy. We're studying two different strengths, and the actual strengths are available. The number on the outside of the bottle is not necessarily the number on the inside of the bottle, which we learned from our compounding measuring, but also when we've compared different, almost commercially available compounds. They don't all have the same efficacy and absorption. We've looked at this in rabbit eyes, and so we're comparing two formulations that hopefully will have a very robust effect, two different strengths, and we'll be sharing our data, the readout in this summer.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So summer of 2024 is just around the corner.
Right. Things are really gearing up right now. So, it's been a long road, and, there's been a lot of ups and downs. If you can imagine, COVID was quite a thing, right? For anybody in the middle of a clinical trial, you just can't, you can predict everything that could possibly happen, but even my sage advisors could not have predicted the whole country
The world, yes,
shutting
yes.
down. And so that obviously extended things and made things a little bit more difficult, but we persevere. There were a lot of ups and downs anyway. There's so much unforeseen stuff. So people with experience can only predict what they've seen that has happened before, and there's always things that people haven't seen. And so we avoided many of those pitfalls, but obviously there are always things that'll happen. Yeah.
No, you're so right about that, and that's really exciting about the STAR study, that clinical trial. We're going to be able to share results as soon as this summer, just a couple months away, and like you were just mentioning, things that we think about a lot in terms of how grit and perseverance is a really needed skill set in everything that we do in all facets of our life, and especially when you take on something as starting a business and being a pediatric ophthalmologist or a medical doctor and surgeon, having like two full-time jobs. What do you think has been most helpful for confronting these challenges, and what would you say to someone else who is an out of the box thinker like yourself, who about what next steps should they do about being an entrepreneur?
Right. So that was two parts. So the first one is how did I manage the time? And at the beginning, it was brutal, but it was fun, right? So at the beginning, it was in fact two full-time jobs because I was so emotionally invested in it. Whenever something didn't go right, I felt miserable and lost sleep. And when something would go great, you'd be, so uh, until we got to the point where we were sort of fully funded and in the sort of beginning of clinical trials, I was putting in a full amount of work. Okay. But after that, I recognized first off that while my strengths lie in clinical medicine, I really don't have any of the level of experience or it might not even be my skill set. So I took a step back, became, a very active advisor to the company, but I was not working full time in the company throughout the clinical trial. And that was good for sort of my mental health, but also it was really what's best for the company. It wouldn't make sense to be, paying me when there's people who are better at that job than me. Just because I started the company does not make me the best person to run it. And I will tell you, when Ken had to have that conversation with me, right when we actually became a real company, he said, what do you think about this? My feelings were hurt, and I think so. Part of the thing about it being your baby is, if you really want it to succeed, you have to do what's best for the company and for the idea. And so, as hard as that is to say, wait a second, I'm a great pediatric ophthalmologist, and I'll tell you, now I'm a pretty darn good entrepreneur, but part of that's been just following along and learning from people who had done this before, because we didn't go to business school, we didn't train
And
in this
I was
stuff,
going to
right?
say that I think it's remarkable, and it makes sense that you didn't need to step back and go get your MBA for this, but you really knew about the value of how basic science drives, clinical medicine forward. But at the same time, you were very self-aware that when you did have a company, and like you said, your conversation with Ken or Janet, and then even how Patrick now is leaving Allergan to join your company, that is.
Oh, he left many years ago. He's been with us for
Yeah,
many,
oh
many
my
years
goodness,
now.
even many
Sorry.
years ago.
Uh,
But so many years ago, that then you even came to this realization, isn't that correct? Because you were able to have a full-time clinical pediatric ophthalmology practice all the while.
right. Yeah. I mean, I love my job. I know you do too. And so I don't ever intend to give up being a pediatric ophthalmologist. I mean, eh, this wasn't a means to get out of doing my job. It was a means to bring something new, and solve a problem. So yeah, I mean, because we're likely about to enter a more clinical phase, I may, convert to working more with the putting more hours into the company, and maybe less at work for the short or long term, depending on what happens. But just because we're heading into the area where I know, you know what I'm saying? You didn't learn pediatric ophthalmology in medical school. You said I didn't go to business school. You learned it by following your mentors, and even some of it you learned after you were in practice, right? It's the same thing. I mean, if you surround yourself with people who know what they're doing, like we've just hired a chief commercial officer who has got a fantastic skill set. Okay, Nick Ruth is his name, and this guy, like, just listening to, like, this is stuff I have no idea about, right? You never see how sort of the sausage is made in the commercial part of it, but just, I'm already sort of absorbing from him a lot, and I find that each different person that comes in, because the company's hired a lot of people lately, I have a lot to learn from all of them, and I think part of that is getting the right people in the door. So you're right, the next 5 years is expansion and more people involved, and hopefully, getting the drug out to everybody that needs it, making it available to everybody in a perfectly uniform formulation with proven efficacy. And yeah, I mean, it's exciting times. It's really exciting times right now.
Very exciting times. And what advice would you give a medical student, resident, attendings in any area of medicine that have an idea that could turn into a business? And in particular, you talked about an IP, and maybe that is something that you could mention, because that would be really of educational value to those of us listening and learning.
Our intellectual property was basically what our value was at the beginning, our patents, right? And and I would say that was, we had very, very good intellectual property lawyers, and we had Ken, who had filed a lot of intellectual property in his life, going back and forth with them, and I most certainly learned about all of that stuff on the job from them. So their expertise, you know, is really what laid the solid foundation for the company, and you need that, right? Or else something else isn't, or else you don't have value. And so the advice, so that the intellectual property conversation is a good one, but the real advice is what I've been trying to sort of hammer home during this whole conversation, and that is, don't try and do it on your own. Find as many people as you can who, or at least fill in all the blanks with mentors or people who have done this before. Look, at if you are listening to this and you have a good idea, give me a call. I'll walk you through it. I'm not going to steal your idea, I promise. And I'll at least, like, tell you what the next steps are. I may be brutally honest if it doesn't sound like a good idea to me, so sorry about that. But at least I'll kind of talk you through, ways to get funded, what your next steps are, give you a sort of plan of what you could do. And if not me, find somebody else that who has done this before, who has experience in sort of starting a company, because at the end of the day, you're a doctor and you didn't train for this stuff, but you're really smart and you have good ideas. And so use the help, surround yourself with people who know what they're doing. That's how you succeed.
No, that's fantastic advice. I think that if anyone is listening to this and you are it just mulling around an idea that you're seeing that could improve things in your patients, or you're studying something in medical school or in graduate school or any level of your training, definitely reach out to mentors for guidance, just like Dr. Ostrow mentioned, or in particular to Dr. Ostrow as well, because he's been able to balance very, very well these two full-time jobs, and they aren't diametrically opposed. You can see how well that they've complemented each other. Your skill set at studying chemistry, and you thinking outside of the box and thinking about making things better for your patients in the state of their myopia progression and preventing amblyopia, is something that is kind of a seed for this foundation. Even though you have a ton of ideas, that even we're just talking about one of them as your entrepreneur. So that's really fantastic.
Before this idea and since this idea, I've come up with some ones that have not worked. So you also have to be able to accept failure and regroup. I had one right after this one, actually, most recently, that I thought was going to be great, but ended up not. So again, you got to keep thinking, keep trying. Don't give up if your first one doesn't work, because that happened to me, and it's still happening.
That's fantastic advice, because that's what's even making you better at being the entrepreneur that you are, and generating ideas and not getting stuck or just resting on your laurels of one idea that makes it to fruition and is becoming the company it is. That isn't the point here, to really talk about how not to give up, but also to keep growing and striving forward as an entrepreneur, and also keeping a pretty awesome day job as a pediatric ophthalmologist as well, and how they complement each other. So thank you, Dr. Ostrow, so much. It was such a privilege talking to you and learning about your entrepreneurism and your ideas and the launch of Sydnexis, and going forward, and how we can't believe we're really a decade in. I'm very excited to hear and learn about the STAR study that's going to be coming out this summer from the phase 3 clinical trials and from all of the patients in the US and Europe. So thank you so much, and it's been a privilege chatting with you today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.